Good morning, and thank you for joining me. I'm here today to announce the completion of the most comprehensive series of post-election audits ever conducted in the state of Michigan. More than 250 audits were conducted across the state, and the vast majority were led by county clerks who received tremendous support and complete transparency from city and township clerks. In all, more than 1,300 Republican, Democratic, and nonpartisan clerks, as well as the State Bureau of Elections, participated in this historic endeavor. Their goal? To examine the paper ballots cast in the November 2020 election, the machines that tabulated them, and the procedures followed by election workers to affirm that the results of that election accurately reflect the will of the voters. These public servants deserve the gratitude of every voter, candidate, and elected official for their tireless work to successfully carry out one of the most challenging election cycles ever. Amidst a global pandemic, they implemented the new voting rights Michigan citizens enshrined in our state constitution in 2018, and then ramped up their operations to support record-setting voter turnout. More than 5.5 million Michigan citizens cast ballots in the general election, and 3.3 million cast those ballots absentee, and nearly 30,000 eligible citizens registered and voted on Election Day. And after the state legislature provided insufficient time to process these absentee ballots prior to Election Day, clerks set up shifts to process and count them around the clock after the polls closed. The result was that within 24 hours after the polls closed, far more quickly than expected, all valid ballots had been counted and the results were announced. Now, unfortunately, Michigan's clerks were still not allowed to celebrate their job well done, nor rest, as their work was immediately attacked by the lies, meritless conspiracy theories, and uninformed observation of the former president and his supporters. Yet they stood strong, and over the past several months have worked across party lines to fairly and ethically audit one another's election procedures and outcomes. And what they found in each and every one of the more than 250 audits they conducted is that Michigan's election was the most secure in our state's history, and the results accurately reflect the will of the voters. This finding eradicates any rationale for continuing to question the integrity of the election and the validity of the outcome. A hand count of every ballot cast for president in Antrim County found that the Dominion machines used there were extremely accurate. And another hand count of more than 18,000 randomly selected ballots from jurisdictions across the state affirmed that the tabulation machines throughout Michigan had accurately counted and determined the winner of the presidential election. Further, auditors of Detroit's absentee ballot counting board found that local election officials had properly counted 174,000 valid ballots that corresponded to signed envelopes that were submitted by registered voters and reviewed by the clerk's office. They found that the reason many of the counting boards were left out of balance without explanation at the end of the county canvass was simply because canvassers ran out of time. But with more time on their side, the auditors balanced or explained 83% of the city's absentee counting boards, up from 27% in November. In fact, the net number of ballots out of balance was just 17. That's less than 1/100th of 1% of the 174,000 ballots that election officials had to race to process, count, and canvass. The same trend played out in the other three audits conducted of absentee counting boards in Grand Rapids, Livonia, and Sterling Heights. All were found to have many more boards in balance or explainable than had been when the county canvass closed, demonstrating what is frankly common sense. Jurisdictions with higher populations needed more time to process and canvass absentee ballots. Of course, that is what clerks and I had been asking of the state legislature for more than a year, only to be granted right before Election Day an insufficient 10 hours for pre-processing of absentee ballots. Meanwhile, Florida had given its clerks more than a month. I repeated my call to give clerks more time in the legislative agenda I announced last month to advance the vote and protect democracy. Specifically, I've asked legislators to give clerks 2 weeks to process absentee ballots prior to Election Day, and an additional week to canvass afterwards. I've also asked them to do away with the law that makes precincts that are out of balance without explanation ineligible for recount. Michigan is one of the only states in the country with such a strict regulation because out-of-balance precincts are common across the nation. They represent clerical errors that can occur when an election worker fails to note that a voter at the polls checked in and then left with their ballot in hand, or if a couple mails their 2 absentee ballots in 1 envelope. While I stand in support of secure and accurate elections that include post-election audits, out-of-balance precincts simply do not merit the criticism that has been heaped on them by officials seeking to undermine faith in the elections of some of our most populous cities. These efforts are dangerous, racist, and undertaken for personal and political gain. They are also completely meritless, as proven by these audits, and must be treated as such in the future. No leader or person of power, elected or otherwise, should have ever played political games with the integrity of our elections. But those who did must stop now. These audits, carried out by hundreds of clerks across the political spectrum and hailing from all parts of our state, make it clear that it is time to acknowledge the truth and move forward. Our democracy requires this of all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Benson. We'll now take questions. If you have your virtual hand raised, we will unmute you, and then you'll need to unmute yourself. Hang on just a moment, and we'll take a question. Rod Maloney, please unmute yourself and state your question.
Yes, Secretary Benson, curious about the specifics of how these audits were conducted. In other words, what did they do? What did it entail? And how did they end up? In other words, did everybody do the same audit, and what were the results that came from it specifically?
The audits, which have been done repeatedly in other elections as well, were conducted primarily on the local level with county clerks working with township and city clerks to either address some of the clerical errors that I talked about in a few communities, or select ballots to affirm the paper ballots were accurately counted by the machines. So these procedures are well established, and they're done not just in Michigan, but across the country. And what we were focused on this year also is taking things like risk limiting audits, bringing them here to Michigan, which have been proven to be the most statistically reliable way of auditing elections, and also relying on the fact that we have in Michigan verified paper ballots that can be reliably utilized to again affirm that the machines counting the ballots are accurately doing so.
Lindsay McCoo, please unmute yourself and state your question.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my question. I'm wondering if you can share some opinions on how you think we can repair the damage that has been done by those conspiracy theories, by the lies that even continue to spread. We heard more over the weekend as it relates to future elections, and really making sure that we can heal from this and don't see the same outcomes the next time we go to the polls.
Well, it's really one of the most important questions I think we have moving forward, because what this data and evidence shows, as audits across the country have continued to underscore, which is that citizens on both sides of the aisle, citizens throughout the country, have every reason to have faith in the results of our elections. And so for the leaders who are lying to them to serve political agendas, to stoke racial animus, to further political gains, they have to stop, because the evidence does not support anything of what they're saying. And more time is going to underscore and show that. And citizens as well have to think critically, have to listen to what is being told to them that's not true. Question it, look at the evidence, because the evidence is there. And once election officials and leaders on both sides of the aisle commit to working from the same set of facts and the truth, we can actually move forward and have discussions about how to continue to advance the vote and improve democracy in the future. Those are the discussions I want to have. Those are the discussions that I'm having with many of our state legislators on both sides of the aisle. That's the work that we all need to do to ensure citizens can continue to rebuild and rightly have that faith placed in our democratic institutions. But again, the announcement today, the evidence today shows that where there has been intense scrutiny over this past election in Michigan, we have responded by simply providing even more transparency, even more examination of the evidence. And all of that additional focus has found that indeed the results of the election are an accurate reflection of the will of the people. And now it's up to every leader to acknowledge that truth, to affirm that truth, to stop spreading misinformation, and for all of our citizens to similarly call on their leaders to do the same.
Tim Skubic, please unmute yourself and state your question.
Madam Secretary, how many dead people voted in the Michigan election?
Well, the lie that dead people voted has long been debunked long before legislators recently said it. Clerks rejected the absentee ballots of thousands of voters who cast them while alive and died. And so we hope that similarly legislative leaders that have wrongly tried to spread that misinformation in recent weeks will again stop doing so, look at the truth, and affirm that these results of the elections were accurate to all of their constituents.
Eric Lloyd, please unmute yourself and state your question.
Hello, Secretary. I was wondering, you said this was the most comprehensive audit that the state has ever seen. Is it be the new norm going forward, or is this in response to all those questions and complaints from people?
Always the norm of post-election audits, re-examining and affirming the accuracy of the election results. It should be the norm in every election, regardless of whether or not there's the type of intense scrutiny we saw over the past 6 months or not. And in fact, that's why I've asked the state legislature to amend our current law to actually allow more audits so that we can use procedures, ways of ensuring the accuracy of the election to, as efficiently as possible, affirm the results and assure the citizens of Michigan that even if perhaps they disagree with an outcome of an election, they can have confidence that the election is accurate.
Clara Hendrickson, please unmute yourself and ask the question.
Thank you, Secretary Benson. I have two questions. First, are you at all hopeful that the outcome of the election audits will convince voters who don't believe the results of Michigan's presidential election, convince them that they are legitimate? And my second question is, why weren't some clerks able to retrieve enough ballots to ensure a complete sample size for the statewide risk limiting audit?
I think for the second question, that created some of those issues that, of course, did not take away from the accuracy of the audit itself. And I think for the first question, my hope is that today will be just another added brick in the wall that we've built to demonstrate the strength of our elections process here in Michigan, and that citizens, as well as the leaders who they elect to serve and represent them, will tell the story to their neighbors, to their family members, to all who listen on social media and elsewhere, just simply what the evidence is. And that the results are accurate so that we can move on and begin preparing for elections this year, as well as to build on a lot of the things that we've identified that we need to do and change in Michigan's election laws and elsewhere to prepare for upcoming elections. It's time, quite simply, to move forward. But that doesn't mean we can't stop listening or responding to questions because especially with this evidence that simply affirms that there are answers at this point that show that the results of the election are accurate. So I do also encourage people to have those conversations with folks who may still be listening to and believing false conspiracy theories and allegations, and simply respond to those questions with this evidence. And in doing so, hopefully continue to educate and inform all of our citizens about the truth, the accuracy of our elections.
Jacob Canklers, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Secretary Benson. who or what is most responsible for spreading the election misinformation that you?
No question. Use platforms, people in positions of power, of course, including the former president, but many of his followers, many others who have, for their own partisan agendas and political gain, used and continue to spread lies and misinformation, even leading into and feeding into the insurrection and the tragedy of January 6th. So, in reality, we recognize that there are a lot of individuals and a lot of individuals with power and platforms who misuse that power and those platforms to lie to citizens about their election and about their votes. And we're here today, I'm here today, to ask them to stop and to ask them to tell the truth to those who look up to them, those who follow them on social media and otherwise, and instead affirm the results of the election, affirm that it was an accurate reflection of the will of the people, so that we can all continue to move forward in service together. And the other thing we have to be mindful of is that in many ways, the misinformation that was used to foment great unrest over the past several months, even leading to violent acts and additional violent rhetoric, is now also manifesting itself in election laws and policies that have been used to actually roll back or potentially roll back laws and policies and protections that were used by voters on both sides of the aisle in the 2020 election, and which led to the historic levels of engagement and voter turnout that in part made this election so successful. So it's also important for those leaders to not build policies off of lies, but instead followed the data and the truth and the evidence to develop election policies like those that I've proposed here in Michigan that advance the vote, protect democracy, build on our success, and continue to affirm a successful and secure democracy for the future.
Arpan Lobo, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. Secretary Benson, have you had any discussions with leadership in the legislature about either your legislative agenda that you outlined earlier this year or some of the bills that have been introduced in the legislature?
I have. Yes, I have, and we'll continue to have conversations with our legislative leaders on both sides of the aisle about, again, what this data shows we need to be doing, most of which I've talked about now for years. We need to give our clerks more time to process absentee ballots on the front end and to canvass those ballots after the polls close. The experience of the 2020 election only underscores what we have been calling on the legislature to provide for since really I took office in early 2019. And so we're going to continue to do that. In fact, that's a big part of our plan, the Advance the Vote and Protect Democracy agenda. And I am grateful for the legislators and leaders on both sides of the aisle who have similarly committed to looking at the data and looking at the evidence and looking at the experience of voters and clerks in the past election and building policy off of that as opposed to in furtherance of any partisan or political agenda.
We'll take these last three questions. Jordan Hermani, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Secretary Benson. I was wondering, you brought up making voting more accessible and that leading to this huge turnout in Michigan, but we're starting to see in other states that as a result of the lies perpetuated regarding voter fraud, like in Georgia, for instance, they're starting to make it harder to access things like absentee voting or ballot drop boxes. I understand some of that is protected, for instance, by Proposal 3, but I mean, lawmakers in Michigan's own legislature have signaled that they are interested in, shoring up areas of weakness of Michigan's election laws. I was curious how much you are, thinking of the fact that the legislature may do this. How worried are you that the legislature may try and find a way to, make it harder to vote in Michigan?
What we've seen is that the signals that voters are sending is that they want more accessible and convenient options to vote. That's exactly why a majority of voters on both sides of the aisle in 2018 voted to amend our state constitution to, among other things, give themselves a right to vote absentee, which 3.3 million citizens on both sides of the aisle took advantage of and utilized in November of 2020. So my advice, my hope, not just for lawmakers in Michigan, but around the country, is that you simply listen to voters and build an election system, an election infrastructure that responds to their needs. That is what good election administration is all about. It's not partisan, it's just data-driven. And you see the same thing from clerks who are on the front lines every day calling for reforms like more time to pre-process absentee ballots that are simply administrative our laws to reflect an election administrator's their job and deliver democracy to every voter in this state. Their efforts to do so last year led to some historic levels of turnout, engagement of citizens, and in my view, election administrators can inform, along with clerks and along with voters, lawmakers' work in the future, and lawmakers on their side should listen to them, not party officials, not those promulgating misinformation or a partisan agenda, but simply and building a system that works for voters, making voter-driven decisions, not partisan decisions. And if we do that, if everyone does that, we can actually have a democracy that continues to ensure that every eligible citizen is able to vote and that the results of the election are secure and accurate.
And final question, Beth LeBlanc, please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, Secretary Benson. Thanks for taking these questions. Are you last of the audits were completed, and is it normal for them to go into March, or is it because of how many were done this year? And then also, I know you talked about like extending the time for canvassing. What is the current time frame for completing it, and what are you proposing it be extended to?
On the second point of the question, the current time is about 2 weeks after the polls close that clerks have to examine and prepare board's review of the election procedures and results. And nearly every time that's occurred, when we've seen challenges, it's because particularly in our most populous counties like Wayne County, people run out of time. There's more, they've got more work to do, more ballots to examine, more precincts to balance than in other more rural counties. And yet everyone has the same amount of time and frankly, for the most part, the same amount of resources to do varying levels of work. So that's one of the things that we are in discussions now with the legislature to address, to simply ensure that everyone has the time they need to do their jobs and make sure that the canvassing process is accurate and that everyone has every opportunity to address every issue prior to any meetings of county boards of canvassers and the like. With regards to the, sorry, remind me what the first part of your question was, Beth.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Yeah. When were the last of the 200?
When were they finished? Yes, sorry. The ones that took the longest were Wayne County's procedural audits that examined quite meticulously every single issue that emerged during the canvassing period, and that took the longest, and that just finished over the past few days, over the past week or so. And so we wanted to wait until every single audit was complete before making today's announcement, which also underscores how much time and resources it takes to actually conduct comprehensive audits. Our work began as soon as it was able to be begun, which was after the State Board of Canvassers voted in late November to certify the results. At that point, under current law, that's when audits can begin in Michigan. And so it took a lot of time, in part because, remember, there were over 250 audits conducted at the state and local level. And so if we want to see that process improve in speed and efficiency while maintaining the breadth and comprehensive nature and approach that we took this year, we will need the state legislature to provide our clerks at the local level with more funding, resources, personnel, to be able to speed up and improve efficiencies in the process. And in doing so, which again is what we've called for a number of months, if not years, that can more quickly deliver some of the type of results we've seen today and are announcing today. But the bottom line, I think what this shows is, and what this underscores is what I began by speaking about, which is how hardworking our election officials all across the state are. They have not stopped working since, I don't know, I took office in 2019, but in reality, since the polls closed, when the voters had finished their job of participating in the election, the clerks have started working, continued working, and are still working now to prepare for the next round of local elections in many communities throughout the state. So if you all can, in addition to taking this data and evidence forward, thank your local election administrators, and if the legislature can show their gratitude by providing them with more resources and support and listening to them as they develop policy, we'll all be in a much better place of both showing gratitude to these hardworking election administrators and also putting ourselves in a position to continue to have strong, successful, and secure elections in the years ahead.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. That concludes our press conference.
Thank you, everyone.